This is the ASUS ROG KERIS 2 Ace, a lightweight ergo mouse from arguably the biggest name in the gaming market. While ROG is best known for their PC components such as motherboards and graphics cards, they aren't exactly well known for their peripherals, and for a good reason, as historically their peripheral releases have been mediocre at best. But ROG seems to have hit a turning point here when it comes to their peripherals, as the KERIS 2 Ace is a surprisingly solid mouse that checks most boxes one could ask for an ergo mouse, but sadly, the mouse does have some shortfalls, as some aspects of the mouse's design repeat many of the same mistakes ROG has made on their previous releases. So in today's video, we're going to talk in depth about all the pros and cons of the KERIS 2 Ace, and also talk about some changes that could be made to improve the mouse in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, a big thank you to ASUS ROG for sending over the KERIS 2 Ace for review, and as always this video will be fully timestamped, so if you're looking for a particular topic about the KERIS 2, check the chapters down below. And if you enjoy the review and want to see more videos like this, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. And as always with every mouse I cover here on the channel, I will have a full teardown for the KERIS 2 releasing in a couple days, so if you'd like to learn how to repair the mouse for yourself, see how it's designed, relube the main clicks, or get a better look at its internals, be sure to get subscribed. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. In terms of pricing and versions, there are two colorways for the KERIS 2, a Moonlight White and a standard black colorway, the one I have today. I did confirm with ASUS that there is no difference between the two colorways coatings, so both of these versions will have the exact same coating, which we will talk about a little more later. The mouse retails for $239.99 Canadian dollars, which is a steeper price than we've seen from other similarly spec'd ergo mice, but we'll have to see if the mouse's performance can justify its hefty price tag. Next, let's talk about in-game performance. Personally speaking, I really like ergo mice, as they're generally the only type of mouse that are compatible and comfortable to grip with my hand size, and since the KERIS 2 is an ergo mouse, I actually quite enjoy my time with the mouse, as it's the perfect size and shape for my hands. In the hand, the mouse feels really good. The shell is actually quite rigid and there aren't any significant QC issues with the mouse. All the buttons are decently implemented. Personally speaking, I find the side buttons to be a little too heavy and the main clicks have a little too much pre and post travel for my liking, but the custom ROG optical switches that are being used for the KERIS 2's main clicks actually are quite good. The mouse's performance tech is also very well implemented, specifically the sensor, and the ROG polling rate booster, while being a rather unique way of implementing high polling rates, does perform quite well. But sadly, the mouse does have a critical flaw, which is its coating, and I use that term very loosely, as the mouse's coating is just a semi-rough exposed nylon or ABS, which feels very similar to the exposed ABS coatings we've seen on the HyperX Pulsefire Haze 2. The mouse does have built-in grips in the form of a ridge-like texturing on the upper sides of the mouse's shell, but these don't really help much as the coating is extremely slippery, even when considering these built-in grips. In order to grip this mouse consistently, especially if you have sweaty hands like myself, grip tape will be a must. Now the KERIS 2 does include some grip tape, but sadly they're not that great. So if you get this mouse, I would highly recommend investing in some aftermarket grip tapes. Personally speaking, I use the X-Ray Pad Gecko 2.0 grips, which were a massive improvement over the included grip tape, and of course they were infinitely better than the mouse's coating, and they actually made the mouse grippable even with my sweatier hands. But overall, the KERIS 2 did impress me in terms of overall feeling and performance. I liked most aspects of the mouse, but the mouse's coating is a massive downside, and there were some other issues with the mouse as well, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, but sadly a lot of these issues are repeat issues we have seen on ROG's mice before, so I'm disappointed to see many of the long-standing issues with their mice present here on the KERIS 2. Now before we talk about unboxing, just as a disclaimer, my mouse's packaging was opened and the mouse was used before I received it. Now the mouse's packaging is fully cardboard, similar to the packaging we saw for the Razer DeathAdder V3 wired, which makes it fully recyclable, which is something I really like to see. Opening the box, the first thing we see is the mouse itself, which is wrapped in a ROG branded baggie. The mouse does come with 4 smaller surface area stock skates pre-installed. Now normally these skates will have a protective blue film over them, but since my mouse was used before I received it, they were removed. The mouse also comes with a USB-A dongle pre-installed in its storage compartment, which is located on the bottom of the mouse. Next we have a USB-A to C cable, which is one of the thinnest stock cables I've ever seen. The cable is very light and very flexible and feels great to use, but I'll talk more about this later in this video. Also included is a USB-C to A adapter, but this one is very unique as it has a metal clip on its base instead of rubber. So instead of the adapter relying on a rubber base to anchor itself like you'd normally see on most adapters, you can simply clip the adapter physically to your mousepad, which is a really cool idea I haven't seen done before. From my testing, this clip works best with pads that are around 2 to 3 millimeters thick. You can use it with thicker pads, but you'll need to loosen the clip screws slightly so it'll fit comfortably. But while this clip adapter actually works very well and is a very unique idea, it's important to note that this is designed to be used on fabric pads only, not hard pads, as the adapter's metal clip can potentially scratch a hard pad surface and or base. Another really unique accessory that's included is the ROG polling rate booster, which you can use to enable the wired or wireless 8K polling on the KERIS 2. I actually really like this booster concept as it's much better than including a 1K and 8K polling dongle like we see on many high performance mice. There is also a small accessory bundle which includes some ROG themed stickers, a full set of PTFE stock skates, and a set of grip tape, and the mouse also comes with a full paper user manual, which I'm very happy to see included, a little welcome card, and a warranty card. Now before we talk about build quality and QC, as a reminder, my unit was sent to me directly by ASUS and my unit was opened and used before I receive it, so take this section with a grain of salt. As I mentioned earlier, the KERIS 2 feels pretty solid in the hand, and despite the unique bio-based nylon shell material, the mouse feels quite rigid and there isn't any noticeable creaking or flexing across the mouse's shell, and the mouse's internal build quality is also quite impressive. All the buttons feel decently implemented and there isn't any unevenness to the mouse's base, and I didn't run into any noteworthy physical or technical issues over my testing. But one really cool attention to detail on this mouse is that on the base there is a small little QR code that you can scan that takes you directly to the ROG support site for the KERIS 2. This is a genius idea that more brands should implement, as scanning a QR code on a mouse's base is much easier than googling a model number or digging through a company's website looking for a support page. Next up, let's talk weight. Generally speaking, ergo mice tend to be a little on the heavier side due to their larger shells and shape, but surprisingly the KERIS 2 is quite light. Now, ROG is advertising that the mouse will weigh around 54 grams with the USB-A dongle removed, of course, but they don't list any plus-minus gram ratio, so I assume it's going to be using the industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams. Weighing in my unit with the USB-A dongle removed, of course, the unit with the pre-installed stock skates weighs in at around 53.6 grams, and with the full-size skates installed, the mouse weighs 55.4 grams. So with either the pre-installed stock skates or the full-size stock skates or aftermarket skates, the KERIS 2 will be well within its 54 plus minus 2 gram weight spec, which is fantastic to see for an ergo mouse of this size. But while the mouse's weight is great, one area where it's a little odd is its balancing. Now, generally speaking, ergo mice are centrally balanced, as most mice are actually, but the KERIS 2 is actually slightly forward balanced, being balanced around 2 millimeters forward of the mouse's midline and sensor location. I believe this is due to the mouse's internal construction, as the mouse's battery is installed slightly forward of the mouse's midline, not towards the back like we normally see on most, if not all, mice. Now, this slightly forward balancing point doesn't massively impact the mouse's usage, but it will feel a little odd for the first couple of hours of use, but once you get accustomed to it, it becomes a non-issue. But that said, I still would rather see the mouse be centrally balanced so you didn't have to go through this weird adjustment period to get used to the unique balancing. In terms of shape, as I mentioned several times in this video already, the KERIS 2 is an ergonomic mouse with a right-handed optimized shape. In terms of dimensions, the mouse measures 121 by 67 by 42 millimeters. The closest mouse I can compare the KERIS 2 shape to would be the Pulsar X-Lite Medium, as the shells are roughly 1-for-1 with some slight differences to their curvature. In terms of the KERIS 2 shell profiles, from the top down we can see the mouse's traditional ergo style shape with its wider, rounder base, tilted mid-region, and thinner top region. Looking from the base we can better see the mouse's ergo shape, and we can also see that the left side of the shell is roughly even with the mouse's side profile, but the right side sticks out much more than you commonly see. From the sides we can see that the mouse's hump profile is centrally focused, terminating slightly forward of the mouse's midpoint, roughly around the mouse's slightly forward balancing point, and that the mouse's shell curvature is taller and more rounded than we've seen on other ergo mice, and that the rear of the shell has the standard gradual declining shell profile we commonly see on ergo mice. Looking from the front we can best see the mouse's aggressive tilt. We can also see the mouse's hump profile, which peaks at the left side of the shell, right side from the front, and it tilts downward towards the right side of the shell, the left side from the front. We can also see the sides of the mouse aren't even, with one side being more flat and slightly rounded, and the opposite side being much more rounded, and it flares out from the mouse's base significantly more so than we commonly see on ergo mice. And lastly, looking from the rear of the shell, again we can see the aggressive ergo hump design, and we can best see the mouse's rear gradual declining hump profile. Now for contact areas, since the KERIS 2 is an ergo, a larger one at that, its contact areas are going to be quite unique compared to more traditionally shaped mice. For my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a tilted claw grip, the primary contact areas of my hands is my low thenar, my high mid palm, and my lower hypothenar. My grip is most reliant on palm and hypothenar contact, less so on thenar contact, but again I am using a tilted claw grip. On smaller hands, your grip style will most likely be the most reliant on mid palm contact and lesser so on hypothenar and thenar contact, but this will vary from hand size to hand size and grip style to grip style. Speaking of grip compatibility, ROG is advertising that the KERIS 2 will be compatible with all grip styles, but they don't specify any hand sizes with this marketing, which I thought was kind of odd. It's also very odd that they're saying that the mouse will be usable with all grip styles, as ergo mice, specifically larger ones like the KERIS 2, historically aren't great for fingertip grips due to their unique shell. From my testing with my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands, the mouse is compatible with palm and claw grips, and you can technically fingertip the mouse, but again the ergo shell and the unique shape does make it a little awkward to grip, so I wouldn't recommend necessarily fingertip gripping the KERIS 2 or any ergo mouse from that matter. In terms of other hand sizes and other grip styles, from my estimations, small hands will be best suited for palm grip here on the KERIS, small to medium hands will be palm and claw grips, medium hands will be palm and claw grips again, medium to large hands will be claw, maybe fingertip, and large hands will be claw, maybe fingertip again, but again I do not recommend fingertip gripping an ergo mouse just because it's not the greatest experience. Next, let's talk about what is in my opinion the worst aspect of the KERIS 2, its coating. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse is using a raw ABS-like coating similar to the coatings we saw in the HyperX Pulsefire Haste 2. Because of this, unsurprisingly, the KERIS 2's coating is very slippery for both dry and wet hands, which means anchoring your fingers anywhere on the mouse's shell is quite difficult. Now, the mouse does have built-in grips like I mentioned earlier on the upper right and left sides of the shell, but these do essentially nothing from my experience as they are just as slippery as the rest of the KERIS 2's shell. From my personal experience with my sweatier hands, the KERIS 2 is a very slippery mouse and one that's very difficult to grip consistently, and it's noticeably harder to use than other ergo mice with real coatings on them, such as the OGM Pro V2 from Wiseowl or the Death Adder V3 from Razer. Now the coating, which again I'm using the term very loosely, is in my opinion the Achilles heel of the KERIS 2, as the attention to detail on the rest of this mouse for the most part is quite good, but for some inexplicable reason, the mouse's coating was overlooked. I generally don't understand how the mouse was shipped with this coating, as this is one area you cannot cheap out with making a gaming mouse. I expect to see a coating like this on a cheap office mouse like the Keychron M2, not a $239 Canadian gaming mouse. Hopefully we'll see ROG update the coating on their next version of the KERIS so the mouse will be easier to grip. Ideally, I'd love to see a chalky rubberized coating like the one we saw in the Death Adder V3 Wired used here, but realistically any form of coating will be improvement over the mouse's current coating, and I use that word very loosely. But in its current state, you'll likely need to rely on the KERIS 2's included grips to actually grip the mouse, so let's talk about them next. Now the included grips come in the form of 2 click covers and 2 side covers. Interestingly enough, the right side cover only covers half of the mouse's side, while the left side piece covers the entire side shell. Sadly, there are no additional pieces for the side buttons or a larger piece to cover the rear shell where your palm makes contact with the shell, which is very disappointing to see, and something that, if it was to be included, would drastically help the gripability of the KERIS 2 shell. Now the grips themselves are disappointingly not the greatest. They're very thin, which is nice, but they're made out of a harder rubber material that has a large triangular-like texturing across it, and the harder rubber material isn't exactly sticky, so the grips, despite being largely flat, are quite slippery. Now to be fair to the grip tapes, they are grippier than the mouse's shell coating, but they're not anywhere as grippy as you expect a grip tape to be. I'd say they're on the same level of gripability as the grips we saw included with the Fantac Helios Pro 2S and Aria 2 Pro, but here the poor grips are a massive issue as they don't improve the KERIS 2's gripability nearly enough, so you have a combination of a slippery mouse and slippery grips. Because of this, you'll have to rely on aftermarket grips to make this mouse usable in my opinion. I used the X-Ray Pad Geckos 2.0 over my testing, and those grips performed infinitely better than both the mouse's coating and the included grips, and allowed me to actually grip the mouse consistently consistently. In terms of the KERIS 2's main clicks, the shell buttons are large rounded angled buttons that match the mouse's forward shell curvature and ergo tilt. They do share the same slippery coating as the rest of the shell, but thankfully they have fairly deep concave finger grooves in them, which does help their gripability slightly, but the main clicks can still feel very slippery at times, especially during heavy use. The shell buttons themselves are decently stabilized. They do have a little more side to side play than I'd like to see, and the buttons do shift a little bit when you press your fingers on them, much more so than we've seen on other ergo mice like the Death Adder V3 and X-Lite main clicks do, but not to an unusable degree. But one very nice attention to detail is that the main shell buttons are indented into the shell, albeit very slightly, so the shell buttons are free from any interference related issues, which is a great attention to detail, especially considering the mouse's more aggressive ergo tilt, as there's not that much space on the side of the mouse for your fingers to rest. In terms of audio feedback, I'll give you a quick sound test of the main buttons here. For the main click switches, the mouse is using ROG's custom optical switches, which are rated for 100+ million click lifespan and are sorted by ROG to ensure that the left and right switches have no more than a 5 gram force variance. Now obviously these switches aren't made by ROG, they're just a rebranded switch, but sadly I wasn't able to find out who made them. I assume they're either a custom mel0n or an FE optical switch with a ROG branded housing, but unfortunately I have no way to confirm this. But regardless of who made them, these switches are actually quite good. The switches sound similar to the Racia optical switches we saw in the X2V2 and X2H, as they have that deeper, clackier sound to them, but their actuation weight is much lower, feeling more akin to the actuation weight of an mel0n switch or an FE optical switch. Speaking of actuation weight, I'd say the ROG optical switches have an average actuation feeling around a 5 out of 10. Both the main clicks have a low to medium amount of pre-travel and a medium to high amount of post-travel, but the post-travel will vary slightly depending on how hard you click. It will also vary depending on where you click the buttons, as it'll be the lightest towards the top of the clicks and heavier towards the end of them. The main clicks pre and post travel is consistent between both shell buttons, and both buttons have decent rebound to them, so the clicks feel fairly spammable. The click stabs are also pre-lubed, which is a great attention to detail that prevent any scratchiness on the main clicks for quite a while. But if you do notice any scratchiness or inconsistency in the feeling of your main clicks, you can very easily re-lube the main clicks if needed. If you'd like to learn how to do this, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the KERIS 2's teardown, as I'll show you guys how to relube the switches in that video. But one very interesting and unexpected feature to these ROG optical switches is that they're hot swappable, which is something I did not expect to see. I can't say that I've seen a hot swappable optical switch until now, but this is a really cool feature to see in terms of repairability, as if one of the switches fails, you can just swap the switch itself, not the entire board. Next, let's talk about the KERIS 2's side buttons. The side buttons have a semi-traditional shape for an ergo mouse, but they're quite small for a mouse of this size. The buttons do have a flat surface, which I like to see, but they're using the same coating quote unquote as the rest of the mouse's shell, and combined with their smaller size, they are quite slippery and they can be quite difficult to consistently actuate. The buttons are also positioned quite high in the mouse's side shell, and they are ever so slightly forward tilted. They're also positioned slightly forward of the mouse's midline, being positioned roughly where the mouse's balancing point is, approximately 2 millimeters forward of the mouse's sensor position. But oddly enough, the side buttons aren't very pronounced from the mouse's side shell, which can also make them harder to actuate in some cases. But on the plus side, the side buttons are very well anchored and there's no wobbling or unevenness to them, which is nice to see. In terms of audio feedback, I'll give you a quick sound test for the side buttons here. Inside, the KERIS 2 Ace is using the Kale Black Shell Green Dot switches. We've seen these used on a couple mice this year, most notably the Wiseowl OGM Pro V2. In terms of actuation force, the side buttons, just like all the other side buttons that use this switch, are quite heavy, feeling around a 6.5 out of 10, much heavier than the main clicks. The buttons do have essentially no pre-travel and a medium range of post-travel and a decent rebound, but the heavier actuation weight makes the side buttons much less spammable than the main clicks. But on the plus side, both the side buttons pre and post-travel is consistent, and the buttons feel the same regardless of where you actuate them on the smaller side buttons. But as I mentioned, these side buttons just have the same issue as every other mouse using these Kale Black Shell Green Dot switches, as they're just way too heavy for a side button switch. I found myself having to shift my grip to actually consistently actuate the side buttons sometimes due to this higher actuation force, and they stand out like a sore thumb from the mouse's other buttons. Hopefully ROG will change out these kale black shell green dot switches out for another switch on the future version of the KERIS. I'd love to see them use a switch with a similar actuation force to these ROG optical switches, maybe a switch like the TTC brown shell blue dot switch we saw used on the Hitscan Hyperlight and the Pulsar X2 Crazy Light for the side buttons, as they'd feel much better than the current switches. I'd also like to see the side buttons made a little bit bigger and have them a little more pronounced from the mouse's shell, as they're far too small and far too thin for a mouse of this size in my opinion. Now the KERIS 2 scroll wheel is made out of a semi-clear plastic with a rubber texturing wrap around it as expected. The texturing is a linear slash-like texture, but unlike most scroll wheels, the texturing here is flattened, so it's not as grippy as the more rounded texturing we've seen on other scroll wheels. But due to its semi-clear plastic, the wheel does have RGB though, which is actually quite handy as it does show the battery level, connectivity type, DPI level, and it corresponds to the KERIS 2's onboard controls, which is a nice thing to see. It's also worth noting that the scroll wheel here isn't pronounced from the shell as we've seen on other ergo mice, so the range at which you can scroll the wheel is slightly affected. This never impacted gaming performance, but I did find myself having to scroll the KERIS 2 wheels more than I have to on other mice when scrolling web pages due to the less pronounced nature. Inside, the mouse is using a TTC 14mm encoder, which I thought I would actually quite like, but it turns out this encoder is actually quite loose. The encoder's scroll force is very light, feeling like a 3.5 out of 10, and it has very slightly pronounced scroll points, so slight in fact that the wheel has an uncontrolled feeling to it, as it's difficult to scroll one point at a time, so over-scrolling the scroll wheel is actually quite common here on the KERIS 2. For the scroll wheel click, the mouse is using a very unique looking pillar switch, similar to the one we've seen used on many ultralight mice this year, but a taller version. Sadly, I wasn't able to verify who makes this switch in particular, but historically these have been made by Kale, so I'm going to assume it's made by them. For actuation weight, the scroll wheel click feels similar to the main clicks, being around a 5 out of 10, but since it's a pillar switch, as we've seen on almost every scroll wheel using a switch type, the rebound is less than ideal, so the scroll wheel isn't very spammable, but this is to be expected for a scroll wheel using a pillar switch like this one. Now before we talk about the mouse's sensor and MCU, I wanted to quickly talk connectivity. The KERIS 2 is a tri-connectivity mouse supporting both USB-C, Bluetooth, and 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity types. But one really cool feature is that the USB-A dongle for the KERIS 2 is an Omni receiver, which you can pair with a ROG keyboard as well, so instead of using two dongles you can use just one. Now ASUS has supposedly done a bunch of R&D on their side to ensure that this Omni receiver doesn't affect the mouse's or keyboard's latency, but there are limitations in terms of polling rate, as you will be capped to 1 kHz when using the Omni receiver, so keep that in mind if you plan on utilizing the mouse's 2.4 AK polling rates with another ROG device. Now in terms of sensor and MCU, ROG is advertising that the KERIS 2 is using their ROG Aimpoint Pro sensor, which is just a modified version of a Pixar 3950. We can tell this as it has the same IPS speed and acceleration rating as the 3950, but this one's been modified to support a max DPI of 42,000 instead of the 3950's stock 32,000 DPI. But unlike many custom 3950s we've seen released this year, the KERIS 2 sensor only has 1 and 2mm LODs. There is no 0.7mm LOD option like we commonly see on other 3950s, and there's also no motion sync or ripple options in the software currently as of this review, and the only performance setting you can toggle on and off on the sensor via the software is angle snapping. But it does have the sensor tilt setting, which I'm very happy to see, as this feature is very useful for people like myself who use an angled grip, and the sensor is also fully compatible with glass pads, which is a nice attention to detail as some 3950s are a little weird when it comes to tracking on glass pads. The mouse's sensor is also centrally positioned as expected, being positioned right in the middle of the mouse's X and Y axis, and in terms of MCU, unsurprisingly the KERIS 2 is using the tried and true Nordic 52840 MCU, the MCU of choice for almost every single high performance mouse on the market. Alright, and in terms of polling rates, as I mentioned earlier, the KERIS 2 supports both wired and wireless AK polling, but to utilize the higher polling rates you'll need to use the included polling rate booster. To enable AK polling over wireless, you can plug the booster with the USB-A dongle plugged into it, right into the USB-C to A adapter, and for wired you need to plug the booster directly into your PC's USB-A port, then plug the stock cable into the booster, then into your mouse. Over my testing, both the wired and wireless polling rates were very well implemented, and the experience on 1 to 4K polling was flawless from my testing. I can't speak to the 8K Hz experience as my system is too old to utilize it, but the other polling rates were very well implemented. And again, I want to quickly reiterate that I'm a big fan of this whole booster concept. I would love to see it used on future ROG mice as it works very well, and including the booster booster instead of a 1 to 8K polling dongle is a much better user experience. In terms of battery, the KERIS 2 is using a standard 300 mAh battery, the usual size for most high performance mice around this weight and spec. Now ROG is advertising that this mouse's battery life will be up to 107 hours with the lighting off and 67 hours with the default lighting on 2.4 GHz. But they didn't specify what polling rate this was measured on, which I thought was kind of odd. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any accurate battery life data from this mouse, as every time I tested the battery life, it would fluctuate significantly. One time, the 1K polling would last 83.5 hours, and then I tested it again under the exact same circumstances, and the battery life rated in at 101.5 hours. So because of this, I can't give any accurate data on the KERIS 2's battery life, but compared to other mice that are using 300 mAh batteries, the battery life is actually quite good, on par if not a little better from what data I could scrape together. But keep in mind, when the battery life is good, there might be some pretty heavy variance on your unit's battery life. And another battery related feature here is that the KERIS 2's USB-C port is universally sized, so you can use this mouse with third-party cables, which is a really nice thing to see. Alright, next let's talk about software, as this is an area where many larger brands such as ROG historically do a pretty poor job. For the KERIS 2's management, there are three options: either ASUS's Armory Crate, which is AC, Armory Crate Gear, which is ACG, or the unit's onboard controls. Now, Armory Crate is the standard software that's included with most ASUS PCs, and it's designed to be an all-in-one solution that controls peripherals, devices, lighting, etc. Armory Crate Gear, on the other hand, is a standalone version of Armory Crate, but it only supports peripherals and has a much lighter and overall easier user experience in my opinion. Now, over my testing, I used the ACG version of the software, and the experience was actually quite solid, no real complaints on my side. I also wanted to mention that while ASUS's software does have a reputation for being a little bloaty, the ACG software was completely fine from my experience and didn't impact my system performance at all. The normal version of Armory Crate Gear, on the other hand, was interesting to say the least. Firstly, it took like 10 minutes to install for some reason. I don't know why, but at least it didn't crash the install process. But the software itself is, in my opinion, much worse than the ACG version, as there's just so much extra stuff in the software you're probably not going to use unless you have a ROG PC or other ROG components in your build, that is. But regardless, the Armory Crate experience was less than ideal. I much preferred the ACG, but it is worth noting that the actual mouse control is the same between both versions. It's just much harder to get to the control software for the KERIS through the Armory Crate software. With the ACG version, it's the only thing available on the software. I also wanted to mention that ASUS is actually working on improving the standard Armory Crate version of their software. They're making it modular, so you can only install the parts of the software you need, such as peripheral controls or lighting only. But even with this change, I would still stick with the ACG in my opinion, as it's most likely going to be a much cleaner experience. Now, the software itself though is quite good. It's easy to navigate and it's easy to find and configure various settings on the mouse. The mouse supports 6 profiles and 6 DPI levels per profile, and you can rebind most of the keys on the mouse aside from the left click and the bottom 2 control buttons. The mouse does of course also have onboard memory, so you only need to use the software once to configure your profiles and settings, and then you can realistically never use it again. And you can actually swap between the mouse's profiles by holding down the DPI button and scroll wheel clicking, which is a cool thing to see. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse does also have onboard controls, but they are a little finicky to use, kind of like how Vaxi mice are, where they're very difficult to use for the first time. Now, there is a guide on how to use this on the ROG website, but I would recommend just sticking with the Armory Crate Gear software. It's just going to be a much cleaner experience in my opinion. But overall, the software experience here for the KERIS 2 is okay. I would definitely recommend sticking with the onboard controls or the Armory Crate Gear version of the software. I wouldn't bother with the Armory Crate version of the software unless you have other ROG components in your PC or like a ROG keyboard, just because there's a lot of extra stuff in that software you're probably not going to use. So I would recommend sticking with the actual Armory Crate Gear or the onboard controls here for the KERIS or any of ASUS's mice for that matter. I also wanted to say, while they are working on an upgraded version of the regular Armory Crate software to make it modular, I would much rather see ASUS create a dedicated web-based software for their mice, as a well-implemented web-based software is much better than any mouse's onboard controls or physical software. So hopefully we'll see them prioritize a web-based version of software in the future rather than a modular version of Armory Crate, but we'll have to wait and see what they do. And in terms of repairability, the KERIS 2 is actually a surprisingly serviceable mouse. I will admit the internal build is a little complex and taking the unit apart is a little harder than we've seen on other mice, but once you get it disassembled, it's actually quite serviceable, which is a welcome surprise. If you'd like to learn how to open and service the KERIS 2 Ace for cleaning or doing miscellaneous repairs, or just see how the mouse is designed and also see how to relube the click stabilizers, or see how to swap the hot swappable main switches, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the KERIS 2's teardown that will be releasing very soon. Next up, let's talk about the KERIS 2 stock skates. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse comes with a set of smaller surface area speed stocks installed and an extra set of full-size stock skates. Both of the skate versions will have a blue protective film installed over them out of the box, so be sure to remove this film prior to using the skates. Now, both versions of the KERIS 2 skates are the standard 100% PTFE type. The pre-installed stock skates are actually quite good as they have a balanced surface area, and the full-size stock skates aren't awful, but due to their unbalanced surface area, I wasn't the biggest fan of those ones. So as per usual, I ended up removing both versions of the stock skates and installing aftermarket ones, mainly the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air Donut and the UWS Silver Fox skates, but removing the skates can be quite tricky as there is no skate removal ramps on this mouse, so you will need a pry tool to remove the old skates, which is unfortunate to see. On a future version of the KERIS, I would like to see some small skate removal ramps included. Another really cool feature about the KERIS 2 is that its skate cutouts are actually very thin, so the mouse is compatible with all types of aftermarket skates, even very thin ones that generally speaking aren't compatible with deeper skate cutouts. Alright, and lastly, one area I'm really impressed with here with the KERIS 2 is its stock cable. Now, the stock cable is a traditional length of being 2 meters long and it's USB-A to C as expected, but unlike most mice's stock cables, the one here with the KERIS 2 is very thin. It also has a very low friction paracord wrapping and it's extremely flexible. It's also extremely light, so it doesn't add too much weight to a mouse if you use it wired. Due to its design, the cable is not only fully compatible with all bungee types, it's also perfect for wired use due to its lightness and high degree of flexibility. The only downside to this stock cable is that the USB-C end isn't tilted upwards, but since the cable is so light and so flexible, this isn't even that big of an issue, and aside from that, it is a fantastic stock cable, arguably one of the best stock cables I've ever seen included with a mouse, and I really hope we'll see this cable type included on ROG's future mice, just with a tilted USB-C end. Alright, well in closing, overall the ROG KERIS 2 Ace for a mouse released by a big brand is honestly not that bad. I definitely see the potential as the shape, design, and performance of this mouse is fantastic, and with some tweaks I think this mouse can be a very solid offering, but to do that there are quite a few things that need to be addressed here. First, this entire coating needs to be replaced by a chalky or rubberized coating, especially on the main and side buttons. The included grip tape should be updated to a grippier design and include side button covers and an additional piece to cover the rear hump where your paw makes contact with it. Alternatively, if the coating is improved, grip tape won't be required, but both of these would be welcome changes. I'd also love to see the unit's balancing improved and actually be balanced at the center of the mouse, not 2 millimeters forward of the mouse's midline. And while the mouse's weight is impressive for an ergo mouse, there are definitely many areas where corners were cut to achieve this weight. I'd much rather see a future heavier version of the KERIS with no corners cut rather than a lighter mouse with many things sacrificed for the weight. The main clicks also do need a little bit of tuning to reduce the pre and post travel and make the rebound a little snappier, but these custom ROG optical switches are really nice and I love that they're hot swappable, and I really hope we'll see the switch going forward on ROG's future mice. The side button switches also are just way too heavy in my opinion, and these switches should be swapped up to a lighter switch with a similar actuation weight to the main clicks. The side buttons themselves are also just aren't pronounced enough for the mouse's side shell and are way too small for mouses of this size, and I would love to see a future version of the KERIS have larger side buttons that are much more pronounced from the mouse's side shell. The mouse's scroll wheel should also be a little more pronounced from the upper shell so the range of scrolling is a little higher, and the encoder should be swapped out for a more controllable one with more pronounced scroll points to prevent the over scrolling issues that the mouse currently has with this encoder. And lastly, I would like to see the mouse's price tag be adjusted to be much more competitive. I totally get that the bigger the brand, the bigger the price tag is, but in its current state, the KERIS 2 is outclassed by many mice that are half or even a quarter of its price tag, such as the Wiseowl OGM Pro V2, Death Adder V3 Wired, Ponage Stormbreaker, Vaxi Outset AX, Pulsar X Lite. There are so many mice that are significantly cheaper than this mouse that are much more rounded in my opinion. And that's not to say that the KERIS 2 is a bad mouse. Again, I definitely see the potential with this mouse, but this mouse is not worth anywhere near 239 Canadian dollars. If this mouse was priced more around the 150, 160 CAD range, it'd be a little easier to recommend this mouse, but in its current state with this price and the amount of issues that are on this mouse, it is just very hard for me to recommend just because the pricing is too high and there are too many issues with this mouse. So hopefully we'll see ROG make their pricing a little more competitive in the future, but we'll have to wait and see what they do. Alright, well with that is going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Big thank you to ASUS ROG for sending over the KERIS 2 Ace for review. I greatly appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see a KERIS 3 in the future with a lot of improvements and a better price, but I'll have to wait and see what they cook up. Big thank you to our channel members here who make what I do on the channel possible with the in-depth reviews and the teardown project. If you would like to support what I do here on the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month, or you can use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, Mech Keys, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money off your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review, the ROG KERIS 2 Ace, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.